Growing up wasn't easy. While I did face some physical punishment, the real pain came from being ignored. My parents were heavy drinkers, and most of the time they barely noticed me. My mom worked part-time, claiming it was so she could be around for her child. But in reality, she spent most of her free hours either passed out in bed or lost in a bottle. My dad was the primary provider, working as a long-haul trucker. He was gone most of the time, leaving me alone to fend for myself. Our apartment sat on the outskirts of a small town, backed by endless stretches of woodland. Since I could remember, those woods had fascinated me. Before long, I was spending most of my free time exploring them. My love for nature only grew, and soon I realized that neither of my parents paid any mind to where I went or when I returned. So, I started staying out overnight, just to see if they'd notice. As I expected, they didn't. That led to me spending days, sometimes even weeks, camping in the forest, my true home. But good things never last forever. One morning, I got caught. I was sneaking out of the trees at dawn, heading back toward the apartment before school, when my father arrived home unexpectedly. Seeing his 13-year-old son stepping out of the woods at 5 a.m. on a school day sent him into a fury. Not only did he whip me with his belt, but I also got a verbal thrashing from both parents. That didn't stop me, though. After laying low for a while, I waited for my dad to leave and for my mom to drink herself into unconsciousness. Once she was out, I slipped away, back to my refuge. Each morning, I'd return before school, and it didn't take long for everything to go back to how it was before. Early on, I realized I wasn't the only one hiding out in the woods. Small groups of homeless people had been living there long before I ever showed up, using the forest as a place to drink and escape the eyes of the public. I made the mistake of staying in the same place too long once, which nearly got me attacked. After that, I moved my camps to the far side of the river. Sometimes, I'd watch them from the shadows, seeing them ruin themselves with alcohol and drugs. Fights broke out often, making me despise them even more. I'd already seen enough violence at home. As time passed, I wandered deeper into the wilderness, always looking for new places to explore. When summer came, even more of them showed up, setting up their filthy camps all over the woods. But I was still safe. I was the only one who knew how to cross the river without getting swept away. Unfortunately, it was those same people who would take my paradise away from me forever. One hot afternoon, I was down by the water's edge filling a canteen when I heard voices nearby. Staying alert, I retrieved my water and started heading back. That's when I spotted a group arguing across the river. Hidden, I watched as 3 men and a woman stood near a ragged tent, yelling at one another. They were too far away for me to hear their words, but they all looked drunk, stumbling around while they fought. I stayed and watched for a few minutes, until one of the men smashed a beer bottle over another's head. The victim crumpled to the ground, unmoving. I expected him to get back up, but he didn't. The attacker then grabbed a large rock and dropped it on the man. He did it again and again, 3 times in total, until he was too exhausted to continue. I had to clamp a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Paralyzed with fear, I watched as the woman yelled something before slapping the man on the chest. He barely reacted, just staring down at the lifeless body. After a moment, the others shouted something, and together, they all ran off into the trees. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, terrified they would come back. But they didn't. When I was sure they were gone, I expected the man to move, but now I know how foolish that was. Something in me told me I had to get help. Drunk or not, he was still a person. So I sprinted the 3 miles back to our apartment, for once relieved to see my dad's truck outside. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, and shouted for my parents. They were on the couch, and when I ran to them, my dad immediately told me to shut up before demanding to know what was wrong. I frantically explained what I had just seen, expecting them to do something. Instead, my dad exploded in anger, not because of what I had witnessed, but because I had been in the woods again. My slurring mother joined in, berating me. The worst part was when she accused me of making it all up for attention. I denied it, but she didn't care. Like always, my dad yanked off his belt and struck me until I broke down crying. Then he told me to be quiet or he'd give me something to cry about. And just like that, the conversation was over. The man in the woods wouldn't be helped. I was just a dumb kid after all. I crawled into bed that night and cried myself to sleep, as I had so many times before. After that, my trips to the woods ended. I wasn't allowed out without one of my parents watching me, and stepping outside on my own was out of the question. Not long after, I was sent to live with my grandfather, as my parents claimed I was too much to handle. I expected life to be the same, maybe even worse. If my mom had turned out so broken, what kind of man had raised her? But to my surprise, Grandpa Henry was nothing like them. He was patient, kind, and the first adult who ever truly cared. I still remember when he first asked me what I liked to do. I was speechless. No one had ever asked me that before. Swallowing my nerves, I told him about my love for nature, expecting to be laughed at. Instead, his face lit up. He spent the next hour telling me stories of the times he went camping with his own father. It was then I realized how lucky I was. As soon as spring arrived, we spent every spare moment hiking through forests and national parks across the country. The knowledge he shared with me could fill a library. Even now, though he's too old to go out with me, I visit him often to tell him about my latest adventures. His body may have weakened, but his mind remains sharp. I owe that man more than I could ever repay, and he did it all simply because he loved me. It took me years to finally tell him what I had witnessed in the woods that day, along with my guilt for staying silent. I wasn't sure how he would react, but after a moment of silence, he just hugged me tight. I was confused, but when he let go, I asked what I should do. He told me to contact the authorities and share my story. That way, I could let go of the guilt. So I did, and once I spoke to them, I felt free. Years later, after returning home for the holidays during my first year of college, Grandpa Henry told me that the people responsible had been found. Only the woman was still alive, but she had finally revealed where the man's body was buried. The detectives thanked me for coming forward and helping solve a long cold case. And just like that, I moved on, finally putting that dark part of my life behind me. That was until my father's recent passing, which has stirred up all these old memories. But now, as an adult, I see things clearly. My parents were the ones who failed. I did what I could, and now, my love for nature has become my life's work. I travel the world, exploring and protecting the wild places I once dreamed of as a lonely kid, trapped in a crumbling apartment. And without Grandpa Henry's love, patience, and guidance, none of it would have been possible. I'm not exactly sure who suggested it first, but by the end of the day, we had settled on the location and picked a date. Although I'd gone camping plenty of times before, I was almost certain neither Mike nor Ray had. They had joined the family much later, after my real father had passed away. He had been the one who loved the outdoors, but my stepdad? Not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great guy, but camping just wasn't his thing. We put together a list of everything we'd need for the trip and stuck to it, including 4 cases of beer, arguably the most essential item. By sunrise the next morning, we had packed up and were on the road, completely unaware of what lay ahead or how it would change our bond forever. The 3-hour drive was quiet and uneventful. I was relieved to see how dry the area was since I had never been particularly skilled at starting fires. Neither of my brothers had ever lit anything more than a cigarette, so I brought lighter fluid just in case. Not that I ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Mike and Ray used what they had learned from YouTube to pitch the tent. I had purposely chosen the simplest tent I could find, yet it still took them almost an hour to set up. By the time they finished, the fire was blazing, and I had already buried the potatoes in the coals, seasoned the steaks, and was well into my second beer. The steaks cooked quickly, and by nightfall we were enjoying a fantastic meal. After dinner, the real fun began. I had deliberately chosen a remote camping spot since we tended to get loud when drinking, and I loved building massive bonfires and cranking up my music, things you just can't do with other campers around. That night was a blast. We tore through 2 cases of beer and didn't pass out until sunrise. It was something I had needed for a long time, and despite the inevitable hangover, I decided right then and there that we had to do this more often. When I finally dragged myself out of my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Mike and Ray were already up, sitting beside the dead fire with beers in hand, looking amused as they greeted me. I asked about the fire, and Mike mumbled something about not being able to get it going properly, which made me chuckle. I grabbed an armful of wood from the tree lean, dropped it onto the cold embers, and blew on them. Within moments, the coals flared up, and the fire roared to life. Their stunned faces were priceless. Mike's jaw dropped, and I could tell Ray was itching to ask how I had done it. While waiting for the water to boil, I cooked up a big batch of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with coffee. Feeling better after eating, I suggested we go fishing. We didn't return to camp until nightfall. Unfortunately, none of us had caught anything worth keeping, but Mike had managed to catch a solid buzz. I cooked up the last of the steak, and we spent the evening finishing the remaining beer. This night was much quieter than the last. I didn't want to build a massive fire since putting it out completely before heading home would be a hassle. Instead, we spent most of the night talking about pointless things, work, relationships, whatever came to mind. By around 2 in the morning, we decided to turn in. The beer had long been finished. My last memory was of Mike stumbling out of the tent to relieve himself. He had drunk far more than either Ray or I and struggled to free himself from his sleeping bag before finally making it outside. I must have passed out soon after. The next thing I knew, the sun was beginning to filter through the trees, and I had to pee badly. I fumbled with the zipper, trying not to wake the others. As soon as I opened the tent, an acrid, charred smell hit me, like burnt meat. I figured one of them had started breakfast and burned it. I turned to check, noticing Ray still asleep. That meant Mike must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. With a smirk, I crawled out, ready with a sarcastic remark. But what I saw froze me in place. The fire was long dead, and Mike was nowhere in sight. The early light was still too dim to make out the large shape lying across the cold embers. I stepped closer, and the full force of the burnt smell hit me. That's when it clicked what I was actually looking at. Mike was sprawled face down over one side of the fire pit. He wasn't moving. Panic took over. I grabbed him and rolled him onto his back, only to be met with blackened skin and the overwhelming stench of burned flesh. I screamed for Ray, but when he didn't respond, I bolted back into the tent and shook him awake. At first, he resisted, groggy from sleep. But when I yelled, "Mike is dead!" directly in his face, he shot upright, his expression shifting from confusion to horror. I pointed toward the fire pit, and as the sun continued to rise, the gruesome reality became even clearer. Ray leaped out of the tent in an instant, coming face to face with our brother's burned body. I stood behind him, silent, my eyes shut tight. Ray collapsed to his knees, wailing. At that moment, I wanted to be anywhere else. The sound of his cries, combined with the suffocating smell, was worse than any nightmare. A cold breeze cut through the clearing, and that's when I noticed I had wet myself. It didn't matter, though. With each passing second, the image before me became sharper, more inescapable. I crawled back into the tent and broke down in sobs. I'm not sure how long I stayed like that before realizing I needed to call emergency services. They arrived an hour and a half later. When the coroner finally took Mike's body away, I forced myself to step outside. Ray was speaking with an officer, but the stench still lingered, making me gag. I retreated into the tent until another officer joined me. We talked about the trip and the events of the previous night. Nothing specific. After about 20 minutes, they all left. Ray and I began breaking down camp in silence. I worked quickly, eager to escape the horrible smell. Looking back, I must have seemed cold and detached, but in reality, I was just trying to hold myself together. As the oldest, I had to be the one to tell our mother. I knew it would devastate her, and I wanted her to hear it from me before the news spread. Ray, however, seemed different. I started noticing the way he watched me. He never said anything outright, but I caught the suspicious glint in his eyes more times than I could count. As the months passed and more questions arose, doubts crept in. The medical examiner's report complicated things. Bruises covered Mike's back, and his skull had been fractured. The doctors said it could have been from the fire, that extreme heat can cause bones to crack. But for Ray, it solidified his suspicions. I had my own doubts, too. I had witnessed tensions between Mike and Ray before, arguments that would abruptly stop when I entered the room. I didn't know what they had fought about, but now, more than ever, I wanted to find out. For now, I had to keep the family from falling apart. Mom needed us, and if she ever sensed the mistrust growing between Ray and me, it would destroy her, maybe even kill her. So, I was going to do everything in my power to bring us back together, for her sake and for Mike's. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, no matter how terrible, was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. I was camping in a small patch of land in rural Pennsylvania where much of my dad's family owned tiny cabins. It was deep in the woods on private land, and nearly everyone on that hill was related to us in some way. Summers were spent by the fire, sharing eerie stories and running around with my cousins. To give a quick layout of the place, imagine a giant uppercase T as the road. About 150 feet beyond the top of the T ran Briar Creek. If you took a left on the T, you'd pass several family homes before the road was swallowed by thick forest. To the far right was my dad's little cabin where we stayed. I often liked to wander off alone, but just as I was about to do so one day, my cousin asked to tag along. She was 14 years older than me, a free spirit with dyed blue hair, tattoos, and standing close to 6 feet tall. Not someone easily frightened. I figured she'd be fine, so we decided to head left into the dense woods. She admitted she only came along so she could sneak off to smoke without our disapproving grandfather catching her. I was a rule follower, so even when she offered, I refused. A dirt path led into the forest, rough and uneven, with the creek still flowing about 150 feet above it. If you veered toward the water, the ground sloped downward. A few miles in, you'd stumble upon one of those bizarre staircases that lead to nowhere. That day, I walked along the riverbank, watching fish dart around while my cousin got lost in her high a few steps behind me. I was in my own little world until a sudden clicking sound jolted me back to reality. Startled, I looked around, and my eyes locked onto a man standing on the other side of the creek, no more than 15 feet away. He must have just emerged from the woods. It was the middle of summer, yet he was dressed in a black coat and worn-out jeans. In his hands was an old-fashioned, cheap yellow camera, the kind you had to manually wind up before taking another shot. I froze. In all the years we had come here, I had never seen a stranger in these woods. He smiled at me, then slowly lifted his camera and wound it again. He looked to be in his 40s, unkempt, lanky, and tall. He took a step forward, and instinctively, I took one back. Then, he wound the camera and pointed it directly at me once more. My mind went blank as I stepped back again, nearly slipping on a rock. Just then, my cousin came stumbling through the trees, mid-sentence about how much she loved being high, until she stopped and saw him. I glanced at her, feeling like a trapped animal, but when I looked back, the man wasn't staring at her. He was still staring straight at me. Then he took another picture. What happened next made my stomach drop. He raised a finger and wagged it in a slow tut-tut-tut motion, then pointed to something on his hip, a knife sheath. Then, he ran a finger across his throat in a slow, deliberate motion. Something in me snapped. I spun around, grabbed my cousin, and bolted through the trees. My heart pounded as I ran, and just before I lost sight of him, I swear I heard one last click. Then I heard splashing. My legs turned to jelly, but I didn't dare stop. The creek had deep spots, but where we had stood, the water would have only been knee-high to a grown man. I pushed forward blindly, like a rabbit fleeing a fox. My cousin yanked me sideways when we reached the staircase, and we slid down beside it, trying to catch our breath. I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to silence my gasping. The woods were too thick to see the creek from here, but through my hammering heartbeat, I could hear it, the snapping of branches. Someone was moving through the forest. Fear gripped me. The path back to my family's land wasn't a straight shot. It twisted through rocky dips, forcing you to weave in an S shape. It was easy to trip or roll an ankle, not to mention the snakes that made us tread carefully. I was crying, struggling to breathe, and we still had miles to go before we reached the first cabin. My cousin, still somewhat dazed, realized I was freezing up. She grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the road, stumbling and running as fast as we could. I didn't make it far before I tripped over a branch, slamming headfirst into a tree. My vision blurred, and the taste of blood filled my mouth. I had bitten through my lip. My cousin rushed back and crouched beside me, whispering frantically. I barely heard her. My ears rang and my head spun. We had another mile before we hit the edge of my family's land and another 2 before we reached my grandmother's cabin. My cousin wasn't wasting any more time. She half dragged me forward, forcing me to move. The next part is a blur. The moment we broke through the woods, we didn't stop running until we reached my grandmother's cabin. I burst through the door, sobbing. No one locked their doors here, but that night, every bolt was fastened. My grandmother took one look at us, bloodied, terrified, and called for my grandfather. He grabbed his rifle while she gathered the men and sent warnings through the cabins. There was no cell service, so calling for help wasn't an option. Even if we had tried, it would have taken an officer over an hour to get up the winding roads, which were nearly impossible to drive in the dark. When my father arrived, he took one look at my cousin and dismissed our fear. He scoffed that she had probably gotten high, and when we stumbled upon some random trespasser fishing, we got spooked and ran. He insisted I had imagined the camera, the chase, everything. My cousin exploded, shouting that I was a good kid and didn't do anything wrong. They argued until my grandmother put a stop to it. Even though the men scoured the woods, they found no trace of the man. That night, for the first time in years, every door on that hill was locked. To this day, I wonder if I ended up in some creepy collection of photographs. But considering what could have happened, if I had been alone like usual, I can live with that. I'm a 16-year-old guy currently living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This happened about 6 months ago during an overnight trip into the Sandia Mountains, which are about an hour's drive east of the city. I won't mention the exact trail because I've been doing this long enough to know what happens when people post locations online. Whether it's a hidden trail, an abandoned place, or something spooky, people always show up, usually leaving trash and playing loud music. The trail I planned to take was an 8-mile loop winding through a canyon. It was supposed to be a simple in-and-out overnight trip. Originally, I was going with a friend, but he canceled at the last minute, so I ended up going alone. With my backpack packed and my car ready, I figured I might as well still go. Because I left home later than planned and struggled a bit with the rough dirt roads leading to the trailhead, I didn't arrive until about 5:45 p.m. For those unfamiliar with backpacking, this is a terrible idea. I had about 4 miles to hike before reaching my intended camping spot, and the sun was going down fast. I figured if I moved quickly, I could cover at least 2 to 3 miles before it got too dark. This meant I was walking a lonely, unlit trail in near total darkness, with about 15 miles of rough road between me and the nearest person. Hiking alone in the dark is unsettling, especially in an area as isolated as this. Eventually, it got so dark that my headlamp was the only thing letting me see where I was going. That's when I realized I needed to stop and set up camp. With only the headlamp for light and trying to move quickly, I didn't pick the best campsite. It wasn't ideal, but there were burnt pieces of wood and an old fire ring, so it looked like someone had camped there before, just not recently. My first priority was getting a fire going. I gathered some dry wood from the area and lit a fire. Then, I set up my tarp and opened a can of beef stew I had brought. I was really looking forward to eating. As I sat by the fire, my earlier nervousness from hiking alone had mostly faded, but not entirely. It's just something that happens when you're alone in the wilderness. To explain what happened next, you need to understand my camp setup. The spot I chose was a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you have a fire going in the woods, it creates a circle of light around it. Beyond that circle, everything is pitch black. I was sitting near my fire, eating, when a small rock, about the size of a marble, landed inside my campsite. I stared at it, shocked, because I was certain I was the only person on the trail that night. I immediately turned my headlamp toward the direction the rock had come from, but the dense trees and bushes limited my visibility to only about 10 feet. For the next 15 minutes, I sat in disbelief, scanning the tree-line for any sign of who or what had thrown the rock. I didn't dare wander too far from my fire, even though I knew it didn't offer real protection. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had accidentally kicked the rock or that it had fallen from a tree. With that in mind, I settled in for the night, not realizing that things were about to get much, much worse. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, soft, but definitely there. Half asleep, I listened as the sound grew fainter, as if whatever was making the noise was moving away. Reaching for my flashlight, which I had left beside me before dozing off, I froze. It was gone. As panic set in, I sat up in my sleeping bag, unzipped my tarp, and looked around. That's when I saw a faint glow in the woods, maybe 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, lying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This was one of the few moments in my life when I genuinely thought I might lose control of my bladder. The flashlight that had been right next to me when I fell asleep had somehow moved deep into the trees. Heart pounding, I shoved my boots on, gripping my knife in one hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I had two choices: stay at camp and wait until sunrise or attempt a 3-mile hike back to my car in the dark. Considering that whoever was out there would have a serious advantage if I was on the trail without a light, I decided to stay put. But whatever was out there wasn't finished. I heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the trees. The sound was distant, but clear. Someone was walking, taking their time, as if they were just strolling through the woods. Sometimes the steps would fade away completely, but after an hour or two, they would return, always at the same slow, casual pace. This went on for hours. Then, around the time my fire had burned down to embers, the footsteps grew closer and closer until they were just 7 feet away. At this point, I was clutching my knife with a death grip, sitting completely still. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For 2 hours, I sat there, barely breathing, waiting, praying that I wouldn't hear anything else. Eventually, the first signs of morning light appeared. As soon as I could see, I packed my things as quickly as possible and practically power walked the 3 miles back down the trail. When I reached the empty dirt road where my car was parked, I ran to it, threw my backpack in the back, and sped away. I didn't stop driving until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I finally pulled over at a gas station in Edgewood, mostly just to be around other people for a moment. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed something scrawled in the dust on my back window. I've had plenty of weird experiences while hiking and camping in New Mexico, but this was by far the most terrifying. I figured I'd share it as a warning. There is something or someone living out in the Sandia Mountains. If you're thinking about going there alone, do yourself a favor and don't. This happened when I was 14. This took place back in 1997 when an old buddy of mine invited me to go camping with him. I hadn't been since I was around 13, so I agreed. It sounded like a great time, and I was excited all week leading up to it. The night before, I barely got any sleep because of the anticipation. He picked me up a little after 5:30 a.m., and we drove about 90 miles to the park. I managed to get some rest in the car, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then, he dropped the bad news on me. We still had a 2-hour hike ahead of us to reach the campsite. I tried to convince him to pick a closer spot, but he insisted I'd love the place once we got there. So, with a bit of reluctance, I followed. The first stretch of the hike wasn't so bad since most of it was downhill. But as time passed, I started feeling sluggish. We took a short break about halfway there, but before I knew it, we were back on the trail. The second part of the hike was much steeper, and before long, I was dragging my feet and barely paying attention to my surroundings. We reached a flat section, and I felt some relief. My friend, who was ahead of me, somehow avoided the trap, but I wasn't so lucky. 1 second I was walking, and the next I was plummeting downward. Hitting the bottom of the pit jolted me awake, and the surge of adrenaline masked most of the pain. As I tried to stand, my right leg gave out, and I collapsed onto a sharpened stick jutting up from below. Apparently, there had been more stakes at the bottom of the hole, but they had mostly been knocked over. When I looked down, I saw my shin bones sticking through my skin. Instinctively, I yanked the stick out of my leg, which only made the pain worse and left me feeling even more nauseous. I glanced up to get my bearings, but all I could see was the sky framed by tree branches. The pit was at least 10 feet deep, meaning whoever dug it must have spent days working on it. I called out to my friend, and when he appeared at the edge, he was laughing, at least until I told him how badly I was hurt. His expression quickly changed to panic. I asked him what had happened, and he said it looked like some hunters had dug a trap for animals, and I'd fallen into it. At first, I thought he could just reach down and pull me up, but that wasn't going to work. He then tried using a tree branch, which seemed promising until I tried standing. There was no way I could put weight on my injured leg. It was clear I wouldn't be getting out without help. Since it was still early in the day, I wasn't too worried. I could hear my friend pacing above me, panicking, so I called up in a calm voice and told him to go find help. The ranger station was just over an hour away, meaning he could get assistance and return before dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but the pain to keep me company. By then, it was coming in waves, and the nausea only made things worse. I considered making a splint, but as soon as I tried tightening it, I nearly passed out. Leaving it alone seemed like the better option. I leaned forward, resting my head on my knees, and waited for the dizziness to fade. After a while, I started singing to distract myself. It worked for a bit, until I heard thunder and noticed the sky getting darker. A little rain wasn't a big deal, or so I thought. At first, the drizzle was light, but within minutes, it turned into a downpour. That's when I noticed water pooling at the bottom of the hole. My feet were already submerged before I even realized the danger. Desperately, I clawed at the dirt walls, trying to keep myself upright, and silently begged for the rain to stop. The more time passed, the higher the water rose. After an hour, the storm began to ease, and I felt a flicker of hope. The water had only reached halfway up my shins. If it continued at that rate, help would get there before it became a serious problem. Unfortunately, it was only a brief break. Soon enough, the rain started pouring again. The only good thing about it was that it took my mind off the pain. I tried to stay positive by thinking about funny moments from movies and jokes my friends had told me. That next hour felt like the longest of my life. By the time help finally arrived, the rain had almost stopped. The water level had risen to just below my waist when they dropped a rope down and pulled me out. Even now, the thought of drowning in a hole in the middle of nowhere sends shivers down my spine. Once I was out, the ride to the hospital went by in a blur. After surgery, where they put in some screws and plates, I was sent home. The next 2 months on crutches felt endless, but I was grateful to be alive, broken leg or not. We never got to reschedule that camping trip, but I've taken my kids on a few trips since then. Now that I think about it, maybe I should call my old friend. It's been years since we last saw each other. A camping trip might be a great way to reconnect. I'll just make sure to watch where I step this time. A childhood friend of mine and her family. We've known each other since we were toddlers and grew up on the same street, even still living nearby. Since we've been close for so long, we have countless memories together. But today, I want to share one in particular. When we were about 8, she invited me to go camping for the weekend at a nearby campground. I was eager to get out of the house, so I happily agreed. We arrived late, around 10 p.m., and decided to have some fun by hiding in the bushes and jumping out to startle people. We managed to surprise a few campers, and most of them just laughed or thought we were adorable before walking away. But then, we jumped out at one man, and his reaction unsettled my 8-year-old self. Instead of flinching or looking surprised, he just stared at us with a weird, creepy grin, an old man's unsettling smirk. Since it was late and dimly lit, I couldn't make out many details, but he seemed to be a middle-aged man, possibly in his late 40s, around 6 feet tall, with an average build. The smell of cigarettes and alcohol clung to him. My friend, let's call her Emily, and I felt uneasy. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there smiling. After what felt like forever, he finally spoke. "You really shouldn't scare people like that. It's a bit naughty." The way he said it made my skin crawl. He kept staring at us with that eerie smile, looking us up and down. I was frozen in place, but Emily quickly grabbed my arm, muttered a quick "sorry," and pulled me away. The next day was normal, and by the time the sun was setting, we were just being kids, running around, laughing, and having fun. While we were playing, we suddenly heard someone yell, "Yahoo!" from up a nearby hill. We looked up but didn't see anyone. So, without thinking, I yelled back, "Yahoo!" in response. That's when we saw someone stepping out from behind the trees and walking toward us. It was the same man from the night before. This time, I wasn't as scared. I was in a good mood and didn't feel as uneasy, so I just stood there as he approached. As he got closer, he called out, "Where are your parents?" Emily quickly answered, "Oh, they're back at the campsite." At that, his grin widened again. "Well, it's getting dark. Why don't I walk you back?" That's when we started feeling uneasy again. We told him, "No, that's okay. It's not that far." But he insisted. "Oh, well, I have 2 kids at my campsite. They have bikes, you can borrow them if you want. Come with me, and I'll show you." A strange feeling settled in my stomach. I didn't want to go with him, but at the same time, I didn't want to be rude. Being young and naive, I hesitated. Eventually, we started following him up the hill toward his campsite. As we walked, he kept glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, grinning, as if making sure we were still behind him. About half a minute later, we reached his campsite. I immediately noticed something was off. There were no bikes and no signs of kids anywhere. A bad feeling hit me like a ton of bricks. Then he said, "Wait here outside my trailer while I grab something." I glanced at Emily, and we both knew we had to hide. We wouldn't be able to outrun him all the way back to our parents, so we darted into the bushes nearby. A minute later, the trailer door swung open, and he stepped out. Not with bikes, but with a roll of duct tape in his hands. My blood ran cold. Even as a kid, my parents had warned me about dangerous situations. I often watched crime shows with my dad and had seen episodes where people were tied up with duct tape. Panic surged through me. His face twisted from that unsettling grin to pure rage as he scanned the area. He looked around, even glancing right past where Emily and I were crouched, hidden in the bushes. After a few tense seconds, he stormed back inside his trailer, clearly frustrated. The moment he was out of sight, I grabbed Emily's hand, and we bolted. We ran straight back to our campsite without looking back, too scared to tell our parents. Instead, we went straight to bed, pretending everything was fine. We went home the next day and never talked about it, until recently when the memory resurfaced. Nothing ever came of that night except for years of nightmares. A summer retreat in the northeastern region of the country operates annually from late June through early August. The camp's main appeal is that it is a week-long overnight experience. Both staff and campers arrive on Sunday afternoon and depart Friday evening throughout the summer session. During these weeks of seclusion, the camp consists of numerous cabins for lodging, a massive dining hall for meals, and roughly 10 other buildings ranging from large, single-story facilities to compact storage sheds. The entire camp sprawls across acres of serene, breathtaking land. The landscape embodies that lush, cool, deep green hue characteristic of the Northeast during summertime. The grounds feature expansive open fields, dense woodlands, a sizable pond brimming with fish, and a long stretch of rugged ravine lined with layers of exposed rock and abundant wildlife. Tucked far away from any major road, a lengthy driveway leads into the campgrounds, giving the entire place an isolated, self-contained atmosphere. Campers are not permitted to have electronic devices, while staff may use theirs only during designated breaks in the evenings. No computers, no personal vehicles, and minimal contact with the outside world, aside from what the camp leadership deems necessary. Staff members carry radios to maintain communication across the vast property. I spent 10 summers there as a camper and another 4 years working as staff, and I can confidently say my attachment to that place runs deep. But anyone who has worked there long enough would tell you that the camp has a complicated and eerie history. There are enough unsettling tales, both those I have heard and those I have personally experienced, to fill an entire book. Over the years, I have come to appreciate the unique and sometimes chilling experiences that shaped my time there. Most of these eerie occurrences took place between 2014 and 2018, when I was training and working as a counselor at ages ranging from 16 to 20. Strangely, much of the activity seemed to happen at night, particularly during training weeks or in moments when staff members were alone. Oddly enough, the campers rarely encountered anything inexplicable, though why that is remains a mystery. My childhood summers at camp were entirely free from fear or unexplainable happenings. In contrast, my young adult years were marked by a string of unnerving experiences, some of which left me shaken. There were certain events that repeated every single year without fail. To begin with, during training week or after the kids had gone to sleep, many counselors would gather outside the dining hall to gaze at the night sky and unwind after the day's activities. The open area had a perfect view of the constellations stretching over the vast recreation field and the rolling hills beyond. On many occasions, we would notice peculiar, quick flashing lights moving erratically, or meteor showers when none were forecasted for the area. Sometimes, red flickering objects would appear deep in the sky, far too low and irregular to be planets. I had friends well-versed in astronomy, and I'll never forget the stunned expressions on their faces as they observed some of these anomalies, whispering that what we were seeing simply should not be possible, despite more than a dozen witnesses each time. Many counselors, myself included, experienced unsettling nightmares each summer, most of them involving shadowy figures standing in the corners of cabins or at the foot of bunks. Every year except my first, I would wake up in a cold sweat, the room silent, my campers fast asleep. Night after night, we heard distant screams or voices carried in on the wind from the direction of the pond. Footsteps echoed around buildings despite no one being awake, and objects mysteriously vanished only to reappear in the most illogical places. Locked doors with heavy padlocks were discovered standing open, and more than once, a counselor found themselves inexplicably locked inside a room they had been working in alone. Skeptics entered the job convinced the paranormal was nonsense, only to leave by summer's end as firm believers. Returning staff members accepted these odd happenings as part of camp life, warning newcomers of the mysteries embedded in the very foundation of the place. My earliest memory of anything out of the ordinary at camp occurred in 2014, during my first summer as a counselor in training. I had always noticed a lone, flat gravestone resting on the hill leading down to the swimming area. It was situated just outside the girls' section of camp, the area where female campers and their counselors stayed. The stone was ancient, its inscriptions too worn to decipher, but its format clearly indicated it once marked a burial site. Whenever I asked about it, the response was always the same. It had been there long before any of us. By the end of that summer, the stone had mysteriously disappeared. No one was allowed to mention it, and if campers asked, we were instructed to avoid the topic entirely. Even though the marker was gone, I couldn't shake the thought that someone still lay buried beneath that hill. Perhaps the camp leadership believed that removing it would put an end to the strange happenings. If that was their hope, they were mistaken. Among the various stories passed around by my fellow counselors, the first ones I ever heard were during the summer of 2014. One evening during training week, we were swapping ghost stories when the older staff joined in, eager to spook us. A veteran counselor, known by his camp nickname Gadget, recounted tales of two well-known apparitions. The first was the spirit of a young boy who had been seen running through the recreation field under the glow of the nearby streetlights. According to the story, he had chased a ball into the road and was struck by a vehicle. Now, he was doomed to run endlessly through the camp, his shadowed figure startling anyone who happened to spot him. The second was the legend of the woman in white. Across the street from camp sat a few scattered homes. Some nights, under the same dim streetlights, a woman clad in a flowing white dress could be seen standing motionless on a porch, gazing up at the camp until dawn. Of course, as first-year staff, we were terrified. It was already well past midnight, and we sat beneath the bright floodlights of the pavilion, glancing nervously at the recreation field and road beyond. Fortunately, another seasoned counselor, Slag, wasn't as amused by the scare tactics. He led me to a vantage point atop the hill and pointed out that the so-called ghost boy was actually an optical illusion created by a street lamp's shadow falling over an electrical box. As for the woman in white, she was nothing more than a large American flag hanging from a porch. When the wind blew under the moonlight, it took on an eerie resemblance to a ghostly figure. I laughed in relief, but Slag remained serious. He acknowledged that while these particular stories had logical explanations, the camp still held real mysteries, ones that could not be so easily dismissed. That summer was only the beginning of my encounters with the unknown. By the time I reached my 4th year as a senior staff member, I had witnessed and heard too much to remain skeptical. Yet, for all the camp's strange occurrences, there was never a sense that the spirits meant to harm anyone. It seemed as though they simply wished to be acknowledged, to be remembered, and to remain woven into the identity of that place. The camp, with its deep forests, aged buildings, and layers of history, belonged to them just as much as it did to us. And anyone who spent enough time there came to understand and respect that. The arguments always started the same way. You'll never catch me dead in one of those packed campgrounds, full of city folks crammed into oversized campers. He was set in his ways and he liked it that way. Calling him old-fashioned was putting it nicely. If it wasn't made of canvas or leather, he thought it was useless junk. My mom tried to get him to switch to modern gear, nylon tents, for example, but he wasn't having it. He'd rather haul that massive, musty old tent everywhere we camped. And don't even get me started on the kerosene cans that always managed to leak all over everything. He was certainly a man born in the wrong time. The phrase "roughing it" must have been made for him. We endured his outdated camping ways until a near tragedy with my younger brother finally changed his mind. Throughout the early 80s, my dad made it a tradition to take us out to the wilderness over Thanksgiving. The weather was usually mild, and the scenery was breathtaking. The scent of pine trees still lingers in my memory. Our trips always seemed to line up with hunting season. I remember hearing that Dad used to be a hunter before he met Mom. I think she put an end to that, and this was his way of pushing back. Either way, the sound of gunfire near our campsite was nothing unusual. Our parents grew up in a time when kids roamed free, so for my brother Jake and me, it was the same. Nobody thought twice about letting us run wild in the woods, even with hunters around. We'd leave at sunrise, play all morning, return for lunch, and head right back out until dinner. It had always been that way. No one worried. That particular Thanksgiving, we had been running through the trees all day. It was the era of action movies. Jake and I were obsessed with dressing up in camouflage and playing war. Jake's birthday had been a few days earlier, and he'd gotten a pair of walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were pretty cheap, but we loved them. After lunch, we went back to playing. I don't recall exactly what I was doing, but I know Jake was trying to sneak up on me. I was perched on a fallen log when a loud bang rang out, followed by something whistling past my ear. I hit the ground, unsure what was happening, but something told me to stay down. A few seconds later, I heard a faint moan. Jake wasn't where I last saw him. I tried calling him on the walkie-talkie. No response. Then I heard a noise. My name, faint and shaky. I called again. Nothing. Now I was really scared, unsure if he was messing with me or if something was truly wrong. I yelled that the game was over and he needed to answer. Silence, except for the rustling of leaves. I moved toward the sound and called again. The rustling repeated, followed by another moan. I ran, stopping just 20 yards ahead. More rustling, this time very close. I couldn't see him at first, so I dropped to my stomach and scanned the ground. Just a few feet away, I spotted the bottom of a sneaker. It had to be Jake's. I rushed to the bush where he lay, and the sight still haunts me to this day. His terrified eyes locked onto mine, and beneath his arm, I saw it. A hole with blood seeping out. Shock hit me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I didn't want to scare him more than he already was. If I'd been older, I might have known a better way to move him, but I just scooped him up and started running. He was too heavy, but I was determined to get him to safety. I made it about 100 yards before I had to stop. He must have been in excruciating pain, because he told me to leave him and get help. His voice was weak, and I nearly lost it right there. But I held myself together and ran as fast as I could for the next mile. Mom must have sensed something was wrong before I even spoke. She screamed for Dad, and when he saw me, he only asked, "How bad?" I was too winded to answer, so I just pointed, and he took off running. By the time I caught up, Dad was already carrying Jake back toward camp. The drive to the hospital, normally half an hour, took us under 20 minutes. Mom talked to Jake the whole way, begging him to stay awake. I sat in the back seat, pressing my shirt against his wound. Dad handed him off to the doctors, who had him in surgery within an hour. The next 3 hours were some of the longest of my life. I was in shock over what had happened to my brother, but I was amazed at how calm my parents seemed. Now that I'm a parent myself, I realize they weren't calm at all. They were just doing everything they could to keep it together. It was well past midnight when the doctor finally gave us an update. It had been touch and go, and I only learned years later that Jake's heart had stopped more than once on the operating table. But he had a good chance of fully recovering. The police arrived at dawn to ask questions. Now that the immediate danger had passed, I finally broke down. That was the first time I fully grasped that I could have been shot too. Jake had to stay in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents got a hotel nearby. I think Dad briefly considered going back to camp, but one quick conversation with Mom changed his mind. The detectives kept us updated, but even by the time Jake was released, they hadn't found the shooter. The most common theory was that a poacher mistook him for an animal and fired. The investigation into hunting licenses raised some red flags, but in the end, there wasn't enough evidence to identify who had pulled the trigger. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and it wouldn't be the last. Jake was one of the lucky ones. That was 34 years ago, and no one has ever been definitively linked to the shooting. But Jake made a full recovery, went on to start a family, and built a successful business. Something good did come out of all this. We never camped in the deep wilderness again. And even better, Dad decided that, after all, those crowded campgrounds with their trailers and tourists were actually a much safer place for a family. Between the ages of 12 and 17, I got to spend my holidays in incredible places. Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon. That was always what I thought camping should be. Peaceful, beautiful, and safe. And I'm sure Jake would agree. I was 15 years old at the time. In my family, my mom, older sister, and younger brother had made plans to go on a camping trip with our aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins for the weekend. This was the first real camping experience for my family, while my cousins, aunt, and uncle had gone on many trips before. The first afternoon and evening of the trip actually went really well. To my surprise, I had a great time. But later that night, at around 10:30 or so, my cousins, my sister, and I were getting settled in our tent, lying in our makeshift bedding, when we heard footsteps moving around us. A little uneasy, we sat up and noticed that whoever was outside was dragging something, what we assumed to be a stick, along the fabric of the tent as they walked in circles around it. At one point, my sister stretched her hand out and felt the shape of a leg through the thin fabric. We immediately knew it wasn't our mom, since she had a distinct deep breathing sound due to a medical condition. Couldn't have been our little brother either. He was only 5 years old, and these were clearly the steps of a full-grown adult. Our cousin told us that it was probably their dad playing a prank, as he liked to mess around at night. But when we peered through the small tent window, which faced the road near our campsite, we saw our uncle and aunt walking back from the restrooms. That's when my cousin, sister, and I started putting the pieces together. Whoever had been circling our tent was not a family member. It was a complete stranger, and the only thing separating us from that person was a thin piece of fabric. As soon as our aunt and uncle got closer to our campsite, we quickly called them over and told them what had happened. After that, everything went quiet. We assumed the person ran off when our aunt and uncle arrived. Even though the situation was over, My cousins and sister were still shaken by the experience. I, on the other hand, was so exhausted that I couldn't even fully process how terrifying it actually was. The rest of the trip went as well as it could, and I tried my best to enjoy it. But the worst part of it all, no one really believed us. Our aunt, uncle, and even our mom just laughed it off, saying we were overreacting. Since my cousin, sister, and I were always interested in creepy things like mysteries and urban legends, they thought we were just letting our imaginations run wild. Even now, after all these years, it still haunts me. I never found out who that person was or what they wanted, and I always wonder what could have happened if our aunt and uncle hadn't come back when they did. It's not like we could have done anything. We were just 4 teenage girls. Ever since that night, I've had zero interest in camping, and to this day, I don't think I'll ever go again. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Around that time, I attended a day camp specifically for kids with diabetes. My mom would drop me off in the morning and pick me up sometime around noon. I have many memories of doing different activities like fishing and playing Twister, but one activity stands out the most: swimming. This memory sticks with me because when I was around 5 or 6, there was a teenage male counselor at the camp. I don't remember his real name, so let's call him Mike. Mike had a split tongue, and every time I was in my swimsuit getting ready to go into the water, he would stare at me in a way that made me uncomfortable, like he was too interested. Whenever I walked past his booth, he would always make comments about how nice I looked and would wink at me. He also tried to convince me to go places with him where no one else was around. As a child, I was very reserved and only went with people I trusted. I was also very small for my age. One day, while my group and I were swimming, my counselor told me it was time to head inside. However, I was having a low blood sugar episode and refused to leave the pool. When my blood sugar was low, I would get stubborn, and before I knew it, I blacked out in the water. I woke up later in the camp's infirmary. Apparently, I had passed out in the pool, and the lifeguard had pulled me out and performed CPR on me. As I was leaving the infirmary, I saw Mike. The first thing he asked me was whether the lifeguard had done mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on me. Then he said it was hot if she had. When my mom picked me up that day, I told her I didn't want to go back to camp. I told her I was just homesick, which was a lie. The real reason was that I felt if I told her the truth, she wouldn't believe me over an adult. Years later, in 2019, I finally told her everything. She apologized for what had happened and asked why I had never told her before. I explained that I had been too scared no one would believe me. I don't know if this man remembers what he did, but I can only hope he never hurt any other kids.